Welcome to the Birth Lounge podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts, support your mental health, and learn the tips and tricks that thousands of parents have used to craft their ideal birth. We will answer all of your questions, the scary ones and the weird ones, to help calm your fears and feel confident going into your birth. I'm going to help you redefine what birth and motherhood looks like and how to embrace your journey. I've intentionally crafted a list of experts to help you navigate pregnancy, explore your birth options, and plan for postpartum so that it can be a time of soaking in your tiny human. We're going to go there on all the hard topics so that you can dive deep into finding your confidence and freeing yourself from fears around birth. With over 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I created this podcast as a way to share the resources parents need to make educated and informed decisions about their care in pregnancy and childbirth. This is a birth community driven by evidence-based information and research in hopes to help you explore your options, understand your rights, and know what choices you have along the way when it comes to birth and beyond. I'm your host, HeHe. Now let's get to the good stuff. Hello, have you heard about my completely free class that teaches you 6 evidence-based ways to avoid a C-section and reduce your tearing in labor by up to 50%? And remember, I mentioned it was completely free. This class is going to teach you how to advocate for your preferences in the birth room so that you can have a birth that's filled with joy and not birth trauma. Advocating for yourself starts with being empowered with the right information so that you can ask the right questions and confidently make decisions during labor based on what feels good to you and your baby. But here's the thing. The U.S. has one of the highest C-section rates in the world, and it is ever climbing year after year. And it's not because the system is broken, albeit it is, but it's really because women don't have the tools to navigate that broken system. We may not be able to change the system before you have your baby, but what we can do is change how you operate within that system. Change the conversations that you're having with your providers. Change the places that you are getting your information to help you have informed conversation with your doctor before you have your baby. I want to teach you how to do that. We know the reasons that our C-section rates are climbing. We know the reasons that inductions happen so often, and we know the reasons that babies end up in the NICU. I want to help you avoid all of that so that you can have a birth that you love. You can find my free class at thebirthlounge.com/C-section so that you can learn 6 evidence-based ways to avoid a C-section and reduce your tearing in labor. Again, that is thebirthlounge.com/C-section. See you there. Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Birth Lounge podcast. All right, today we have a really fun guest. I'm so excited to be able to share the story of 5 births from someone who every single time she had a baby, she improved her birth experience just a little bit. It got better and better each time. Today I'm joined by my friend Brigid Tebaldi, who is going to step us through what each of her births look like. And you guys, in her first birth, they held her freaking baby in. She was trying to push her baby out, and she had a medical provider physically stop her from doing that, which is a stark difference from her last birth, which was pretty much a hands-off home birth. Just such a good, wholesome story of being able to use each of your pregnancies and your birth to get a little closer to the birth goals that you have till you finally have the birth of your dreams. Brigid is a mom of 5, so she has the opportunity to do this 5 times. And she does such a beautiful job of explaining exactly what steps she takes to be that empowered birther, to take control of her story, to improve her experience with every single birth she does. In this episode, we're going to dive into what she felt like when she found out that she was pregnant. Because you see, Brigid had never really ever been around babies. She didn't really have women in her life that were having babies, not growing up, but also not her friend group. She's going to share what she learned about natural family planning and how she made the shift to midwifery care along her journey. We are also obviously going to dive into mindset. And so I'm going to pick her brain about overcoming narratives that we all make up in our heads. And we're going to get the nitty gritty details on her final birth, which she calls addicting. So, if you're out there listening as a first time mom and you are being, having the bejesus scared out of you about childbirth, I want to remind you that it does not have to be that way. You can absolutely have this joyous and joyful, empowering, transformative experience that leaves you in a better place mentally, emotionally, maybe not physically because you just had a baby, but definitely emotionally, spiritually, mentally after having your baby. You will walk away feeling so proud of yourself, inspired by yourself, like a complete badass, knowing that you just did something that a lot of people consider impossible. But it wasn't impossible for you. If you are a second, third, fourth time mom out there and you have previous births that didn't go like you hoped that they would, I want to let you know that you don't have to do that again. You can have a different experience this time. Let me challenge you to think about what would you change in this upcoming birth. If you've had a previous birth that you don't like, what would you do differently this time? And then I want to teach you how to do that. And that's exactly what I do in the Birth Lounge membership and inside the Birth Lounge app. Bridget is such a good example of this. This episode is truly a story of trauma to triumph, and it is so inspiring. You ought to know that you are worth the care that makes you feel seen and supported and heard and respected and loved and cared for. And I cannot wait for you to learn from Bridget exactly how she did it so you too can do it for your birth. All right, you guys, without further ado, Bridget, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. You and I have chatted before, and I found the conversation really natural. So I'm very excited to have you here today. And it's kind of funny. I don't ever really talk about resiliency, but when you and I talked, I was like, oh my God, we should talk about like this on the podcast. And then just today, I had another conversation where someone asked me about resiliency, and I was like, what
Oh,
is happening in the universe? What message is trying to download right now? So I'm excited for this conversation. And I think a lot of people probably need to hear how to build resiliency and how can you make that a pillar in your family and your core values. But before we do all that, I would love to hear your birth stories, which I, listeners, in all transparency, have heard them before, but only a shallow version. So tell us all about your entrance into motherhood each time.
yeah. So I have five little kids. I have an 8, a 6, a 4, a 2, and a 9-month old. So the 9-month old is sleeping on me right now. So hopefully he stays asleep this whole time, but we'll see. So again, I have a lot of children, thankfully. And so whenever I was pregnant with my first, we got pregnant like 2 months after we were married. And it wasn't like an accident, but it wasn't like on purpose because we were practicing natural family planning. So like we knew it was a possibility, but it's like, no, that doesn't happen. Like not yet. But it happened. And so we ended up again getting pregnant and I had like literally no experience with pregnancy before this at all. I had known one my neighbor growing up, she was pregnant, but I didn't even really know she was because I was only like 6 or 7 at the time. And then she just showed up with this baby and I met the baby. And then the only other recollection that I have with the pregnant woman was this girl on my soccer team, her mom came over and my dad was like, she's either pregnant, but I don't want to ask her because that's rude, but she's either pregnant or she has like something medically wrong that she needs to address. So she was obviously pregnant. So those are my only two interactions with pregnancy before I became pregnant. And I went into like kind of the standard of care, called DOB, did all like the testing and everything like that. My daughter ended up being like, I measured small a lot of the time. And so I had so many ultrasounds, which looking back, I wouldn't necessarily have done that. But at the time, I didn't know any better. And so then she was born about 1 week early, actually. So she was about 39 weeks. And I know that because, again, we were practicing natural family planning. So I know exactly when things were happening. And basically, though, that birth, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. So I started having contractions. And then I was like, Mom, do I need to go to the hospital? Like, I don't really know what's happening. And she was like, Yeah, you should go to the hospital. So I went to the hospital. Everything was going fine. I already knew I didn't want an epidural. I wanted to like do everything as natural as possible, like everybody says. And I did do it naturally. But what happened was that I labored pretty quickly. It was about 8 hours or so total. The doctor almost missed it. So the nurses, I was like ready to push. I had that like feeling that I needed to push. The nurses were literally holding her head
Oh,
inside of me as my body is like forcing her out and like literally holding her head in. And the only reason that I really know that is because my husband was on one side, my mom, who was a doctor herself, was on the other side, and my mom was like watching everything that was happening. And they were like, my mom was like, "Why won't you just let her deliver the baby?" And they're like, "Oh, the doctor needs to be here." So after about 10 minutes or so of like literally her head being held in, the doctor showed up. She easily came out, but I had a pretty significant tear up through my urethra, which was not fun at all. And then just like everything was fine after that. Like she nursed well and like postpartum was generally fine, but it was just like being thrown into motherhood. I had no idea what I was doing. And thankfully, I didn't necessarily have like the pressure of needing to return back to work in 6 weeks or anything like that because I was a teacher at the time, so I had the summer off. But still, it was just like a lot was happening. And then about 2 years later, I had my son. And this is where it kind of goes haywire because my pregnancy was fine, but I was always really nervous about going into the OB's office. I was like since I started seeing him because, but he was a very nice man, but he was actually friends with my mom. It was just like I probably shouldn't have seen him anyways for that reason. But so I felt very nervous going into him. So every time I went into his office, my blood pressure would like go through the roof, like really high. But then as soon as I left, I felt fine. So it was just more of the like monitor at home, is everything like everything's going okay, that sort of thing. Same pregnancy, did all the testing, everything pretty much the way that you're told to do it in the medicalized model. And again, everything was fine until I was 39 weeks exactly. And I started having contractions around like 6:30 in the morning or so. No, it wasn't 6:30. What time was it? 8:30 in the morning or so. And but they were like so mild. Like it just felt like I had a cramp every once in a while. And so my husband went to work. He works about 20 minutes away from our house. I was like, we're probably going to have a baby soon, but probably not soon. So you can go to
not
work.
now.
Yeah. And then at about 8:55, things started really picking up. It went from like cramping to like I couldn't talk in the span of just a few minutes, which I know from my previous birth, like that wasn't how it was before. So I didn't really know what was going on. So I called my husband. I was like, you need to get home right now. And then my mom, thankfully, was only like 10 minutes away at her office. So she was able to come over and watch our 2 year old. And I somehow made it from our house down the stairs into the car. And he drove me to the hospital. That was again about 25 minutes away. And literally got out of the hospital, got out of the car, went into like the ER entrance area, tried to sit down. The lady was like, "Oh, it looks like you're having a baby," and I'm like, "Yeah, I am. Like right now, I am."
Literally right now. It's actually happening in this moment,
Yes,
actually right
exactly.
now.
And she was like, "Oh, well, you can't do that here." And I was like, "I know." Like,
Well,
and she was like, "Well, you need to fill out these forms." And I'm like, "Well, I can't fill out the forms right now." And so I somehow got in a wheelchair, made it upstairs. It's all kind of a blur. But I laid down, like I didn't even lay down on the bed. I was like half off of the bed whenever I got upstairs, still like fully clothed and everything. And he just made his entrance. And it
hi,
was fine.
baby.
Yeah, it was fine, except for the nurses kind of like immediately cut the cord, took him away. I remember laying there, like, is he okay? Like, he's not crying. Is everything okay? And I look over and he's kind of bluish. And nobody's really saying anything because I live in a small town, so there's no OB in the hospital. It was whoever your OB is, they would come in because they were always on call. So there was no OB in the office. It was just these two nurses. And again, they kind of just took my baby away. I had no idea what was happening. And then about 5 minutes later, they finally brought him back. And I have the pictures of me with him for the first time, like still wearing my t-shirt that says like Tony Surf Shop on it. and then
That is iconic. I love that.
and then it was probably like 40 minutes after he was born, the nurses bring over all this paperwork to sign. And I'm like, half of this isn't even applicable because he's already born. They're like, I know, but you just have to sign it. So I signed all this paperwork, everything like that, and everything was fine. I was like, I feel awesome. I can go home right now. But had to go into the postpartum room. And then about 4 hours later, everything was still fine. We were getting a steak and lobster dinner because that was like what the hospital tried to do to make it things super sweet. I remember the guy was coming down the hallway wheeling like the nice little candlelit dinner in, and I get up to go to the bathroom before he gets in, and I look down and there was no blood at all, which is very odd because if you've just given birth, you would expect some blood to be there, but there was no blood at all. And I was like, oh, this is weird. Maybe I'm just healing really fast. Again, pretty naive about things. And then I go and sit down and get my baby back. He starts nursing, and all of a sudden, my mother-in-law looks at me and goes, Brigid, you should push the call button. And I was like, why? What's wrong? And she was like, just push the call button. So I pushed the call button, and then I looked down and there's blood everywhere,
Hmm.
like all over the bed. I was wearing normal, like regular clothes at this point. So like my sweatpants were totally drenched, like blood was everywhere. And I was like, oh, okay. And it took a while for the nurses to get in. Again, my OB wasn't there technically, but he was in a training downstairs, so they were able to actually call him and he got in there pretty quickly. But I just remember this big like whirlwind of like people. They were calling codes, and at the time I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound like a good code. I forget, is it code blue? Whatever the bad code is, where you need like the respirator things. And it was like, this doesn't sound good. And then the anesthesiologist comes in and she like shoves papers in my face and is like, you need to sign this. And I'm like, I don't know what this says. Like, I can't read this. Can my husband sign it? And she was like, no, you have to sign it. So I scribble something. The nurses are like pushing all over my stomach, saying, she's hard, she's hard. Like, we don't understand where this bleeding is coming from because typically if you're bleeding, it's your uterus and it's pretty boggy, but it wasn't. It was hard and like pretty shrunken down at that point. So basically, they took me to the OR. I still remember my husband standing at the doorway. My baby was with my mother-in-law, and she was just walking the hallways with him, thankfully. And so I remember my husband standing at the doorway, and like they just closed the door. I get put in the OR, and at this point, I think there's still blood coming everywhere. I don't really know. And then the anesthesiologist, I always wear a crucifix, and she was like, I'm gonna have to take this off. And I was like, can you leave it on? She said, no, in case I have to resuscitate you. And I was like, oh, okay. So she took it off and then had me count down. And I think I got to like 8 or something. And that's the last thing I remember. And then I woke up in the recovery room. It was only like a 25, 30-minute surgery. So it wasn't really that long that I was out or anything like that. And again, thankfully at this small hospital, my mother-in-law was able to just hold the baby, walk him around, and he had just eaten, so he was happy and slept. But I stayed in the recovery room for like an hour or so, came back to the regular room, got my baby back, and just like had no idea what was happening. Like I didn't know what just happened because nobody explained anything to me. And I all night I felt horrible. I couldn't sleep. I had like a lot of what is it, like night sweats, and then I would get super, super hot and then I'd get freezing and I would be shivering and I would be sweating and it was just like a terrible night's sleep. The nurse's aide or whomever was coming in and checking my blood pressure all the time and temperature and everything like that. It was just like not a good night. And then eventually the next day, the PA comes in and like kind of explains what happened to me, but basically she said, you don't really want to know what happened. And I was like, okay.
I
So
do
I had a
actually.
cat. All right. And I figured out what happened later on. But at the time I was like, this is weird, but okay. And I was just told that I had a catheter and it was like packed up and everything was fine. And then I did have to get a blood transfusion because I lost quite a bit and my levels are pretty low. And so then the next day the PA comes back and she's like, okay, I'm going to take all the dressing out. and she just like pulled so, like feet of dressing out of me. I'm like, how is this even inside of me? And then I finally asked her what happened, and I was like, what exactly happened? And she said, well, as far as we can tell, there was some sort of tear in an artery in your vaginal wall. And I was like, how does that even happen? Like, never heard of that happening. And then eventually the doctor comes in and he says, I've only seen it, or he had seen it one other time in his career, and he's like a 70 something year old doctor. So he said it's incredibly rare. And so that was that. Had the blood transfusion, was told to take iron supplements, do all the things. Looking back, I would have done totally differently, but I can't. And so went home, and the next few weeks and months were just sort of like kind of a blur, honestly, because I went from the postpartum, it's like having from one kid to two kids is obviously like a change. But then on top of this, like everything that happened, I could not sleep because I was so scared I was going to bleed out again. I remember whenever I went into the doctor, I like the pediatrician, I was filling out like the postpartum depression papers that they have you fill out, and I was like, clearly something was wrong with me, and nobody said anything. And it's like I didn't want to say anything because if I said something, then that means that like I'm a bad mom because I need help, and like all these irrational thoughts in my head. And it took a long time for me to work through all of those things. But I did, thankfully. And then for my third birth, just for sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Third birth, kind of the same deal. The OB was pretty nervous about what happened last time. So I went into the doctor at 39 weeks. My blood pressure was like 139 over 86 or something. And he immediately goes, okay, your blood pressure is too high. You need to get an induction. And so go to the hospital. My blood pressure's normal in the hospital, but whatever. I get the induction. Thankfully, it was like pretty straightforward. I just needed cervical ripening. I didn't need Pitocin or anything like that. And again, it was, by the grace of God, fairly straightforward. I was very nervous, but again, everything went pretty. And then for my third birth, or sorry, fourth birth, I was like, I need to do something differently because I am so scared to go back into this hospital because something is probably going to go wrong. Because every time I go in there, I feel so nervous. And so I stayed with the OB that I was with, but I also started talking to home birth midwives. And I found one that I actually worked out with. I was at a CrossFit gym and she was also there and we were working out. We were talking. She was like, oh, yeah, I'm a home birth midwife. And I'm like, oh,
Amazing.
really? So it ended up working out well because I chose her and her partner to attend my births. And they were amazing because I was still so nervous about like, well, what happens if I need to transfer? What happens if this happens or that happens? And the one partner, she is probably in her 70s and she's attended over 1,500 births. So she is like
Wow.
a lot of experience. And so that made me feel just a lot better. And like she's good with breech, she's good with twins, she's good with emergencies, like she's good with all these things as much as you can be. And so I had my fourth baby at home. It was great. I was still pretty nervous. So again, I probably would have done things a little differently for his birth, but it went very well. Like everything was fine. And then for this last baby that he was born at the end of April, I did my pregnancy like totally differently. Everything was different about it. From what I ate to what I like thought about to what I read, everything was different. And I started doing that with number four as well. But this one time it was just completely different. It was like the whole experience was just amazing. From the prenatals to his actual birth. I remember I actually gave an interview after his birth, and I remember saying like his birth was addicting. Like I could totally do that again because I went into labor probably at like 8:30 at night, but I didn't really tell anybody what was happening. And I just sort of like did what we usually do. And then around like 10:30 at night, I remember being like, oh, so I texted the midwives and I was like, you might get a call from me. And then yeah, just from like 10:30 until like 6 a.m., I just tried to sleep, but I spent a lot of the time on the toilet because that's where it felt comfortable to just sit there on the toilet and like to sit backwards on it and everything. And I just did it like by myself alone at night. and it was really calm and peaceful, and it was just like nice. And I swear this might sound really strange, but I swear I could literally feel my cervix opening like at certain times, and it's like, okay, this is what's happening. And then around 7 o'clock or so, I called the midwife and I was like, you should get here now. And my mother-in-law took my kids to my parents' house, and the baby was born at like 8:45. Again, literally the midwife stood in the corner until I told them that I was ready for them to do anything. And even then, it was basically just helped me get from the position I was in to on my back. They didn't even like touch the baby or anything. It was just, they were just there for help. And postpartum was great. And yeah, it was just like such a beautiful experience that I want everybody to have.
I love to see the growth and development of you as like a birthing woman from start to finish. Like you can literally see how you improve and upgrade and uplevel your birth every single time you have a baby until you finally got like an ideal birth where you did it in a place that you love. It seems like you had a pretty good pregnancy because you were very intentional about it. You got to be in control of who touched who, when, and where, and how, which is very different than your first birth that your nurse held in your baby, which I am shooketh to my core about. That is
Yeah, right?
actually so disturbing.
It was very painful.
Did
So,
your daughter suffer any sort of trauma from that?
not any physical trauma that we know of. Again, somehow by the grace of God, everything was fine. I really do think, like, I love God. And so I really do think that He has placed me in all of these different scenarios so that I can be where I am now. And like He made things happen that shouldn't have happened, or like kept people healthy that shouldn't have been healthy or whatever, so that I can be here now to share this story and to help others. So I really do believe that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, how just horrific that is. Okay, I want to back up all the way until the moment that you found out you were pregnant. Having such like kind of shallow knowledge and
Yeah.
interactions, very limited interactions with people who were pregnant, when you found out you were pregnant, what went through your mind? What were you thinking?
All right. So just to preface this, at the time I was teaching, I think it was five or six, it was five classes at a high school. I was a science teacher. And so I was busy doing that. And then I would come home and I would teach horseback riding lessons and I would like train horses for people. And so I remember I was driving about an hour away to give lessons at this barn. And I remember thinking, like, I feel like I'm probably pregnant. And I was so scared because I was like, this is not according to my timeline. This is not how it's supposed to be. Like, I have all these horses that I'm training for people. I teach all these lessons. Like, how is this going to work? And so I was like, but I can't be pregnant. So I remember being like, I should stop at a drugstore and get a test. And I was like, but no, I'm not going to because I'm not pregnant. And then I started having like all of the telltale signs. Like my boobs hurt, like they were really sore, and things just felt different. So didn't have a test with me because I was stubborn and I was like, I don't need a test. So I actually was Googling it and I found like the sugar test that you can do, where
Which
if you
is
put like
what?
I don't really remember it exactly, but it's something where if you put sugar in urine, it like reacts a certain way if you're pregnant versus if you're
Okay.
not. And I did that and it reacted positively. And I was like, no,
Well, this
can't
one
be.
clearly doesn't work because I am not pregnant.
So that day I went to the drugstore and I did get a test and it was positive. And I remember I was so scared because my husband he graduated college in May and it was August that we found out. And I was like, no, like this isn't enough time. I only just graduated. I started a master's degree. Like, I can't do this. And so I just remember telling him, and he was like so sweet about it. He was like, oh, this is so exciting. And I was like, yeah. But I was really scared, really scared.
Yeah. I think so many people resonate with that. And I don't think you're alone in not having much interaction with pregnant people. I mean, I think a lot of people go into pregnancy where like, yeah, they know a pregnant person or two, but it's like they don't really none of the women in their life have ever been, close women have
Yeah.
ever been pregnant in terms of like them being involved with it. So, yeah, I don't think that you're alone in that. Okay, I too also use natural family planning. Tell us about your journey to decide to use natural family planning. We've been using it for several years. I see you like smirking. Do you smirk because you started using it and then immediately got pregnant?
No, I think it's great. I wish that more women knew about it, just because, again, not just for pregnancy related to pregnancy, but just for an overall health standpoint. I wish that more people knew about it.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you decide to like come to that decision?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't, I have always been somewhat naturally minded, and just the idea of like birth control never sat well with me. It just always felt very, I don't know, it just never sat well with me.
Yeah.
So whenever we were like doing our marriage prep and that sort of thing, we had to take a natural family planning class. And it's like, okay, I guess I can learn about this. So we learned about a lot of the different methods, and we ultimately chose to use a specific one, which is the Billings ovulation method. And I was like, oh, because it's easy-ish, as easy as they can be, and it's free. Like I didn't want to use another method that you had to buy stuff because we were right out of college and didn't have a lot of money. And so we started with Billings, and then it works very, very well. I will say that. Like I knew exactly whenever I had fertile days. And I remember talking to my husband about, we're like, if we use these days, things could happen. And we're like, oh yeah, it's fine. No, nothing's going to happen. And
Not to us though.
yeah, but I can say that we've stuck with the Billings method, and I can literally tell you within like 12 to 24 hours ish when each of our kids have been conceived because of the method, even with me nursing for like 18 months each baby. So it works very well.
Wow, I love that. Yeah, my audience is not new to like fertility tracking and stuff like that. Like I say, I've been using it for several years. I actually do use the device because I just like the device,
Yeah,
but I have a Tim
yeah.
drop and I just find a lot of comfort in it.
I have a
I know
Mira,
that's,
so
not
I
the
get it.
greatest. I should not use it as a crutch, but I do. It's so easy. You just put it on your arm, it syncs to your phone. I love it so much. I did start out doing the charting, so I know how to chart, but the Tim drop just makes it so easy. I love it, but I have used it to avoid pregnancy. So yeah, if you're listening and you're like, "Oh my God, I don't want to get pregnant anytime soon," this is a great way to know
Yeah,
exactly what you said, Bridget, is like days that you are safe to, you know, make a baby and days that you should take extra precaution if you don't want to make a baby. And I think that that gives you a lot of insight to your hormone health and your menstrual cycle. And it can just be super duper insightful. Cool. Okay. I have a question about the trauma that comes along with having a precipitous birth. This is something that I've talked about with so many people, and I talk about it a lot when I talk about precipitous labors because a lot of people are like, oh, I'd love to have just a really quick labor without realizing that it comes with its own set of, roadblocks and traumas and things to process, but lack thereof to do so. Like talk to us about what that experience was like and what would you do differently now on this side of having a precipitous labor if you knew that that was a possibility?
yeah, I would totally agree with you on that. In that a lot of women think like, oh, this would be so awesome to only have an hour or two labor. And I mean, in theory, it does sound really nice, but what ends up happening, or what happened to me and what I've worked with some other women with, is that it does not give you enough time to like get things settled, especially if you have more than one kid, especially, or if you have, yeah, more than one kid, especially if you're going to be birthing like in a hospital or somewhere that you need to get to. It really does not give you a lot of time to get those things done. And so luckily for me, like I was at home, I was folding laundry, like I was somewhere where I didn't have to rush out of. Well, I mean, I rushed, but like, you know what I mean? I wasn't like at work that I had to go home and then do this and that. But it really does make it harder in that regard, in that you don't have the time that you would if you had quote, like a normal labor of 6 to 12 hours or so. The other thing is that it was so intense. Like it was again kind of crampy, and then it was like,
A bullet train.
yeah, it was so intense.
Yeah.
And I remember timing it, like timing the contractions and being like, oh, okay, they're still like 20 minutes apart. Like these little cramps, they're like nothing. So that's why I never called anybody, because it's like I still have so much time if it's just cramps. And then all of a sudden it was like, it was literally, it would go from like would have one big contraction like every 10 minutes or so to like every 2 minutes, just like literally within one contraction. And I remember I got a lot of, I don't want to say like flack for it, but I got a lot of comments. It's like, well, why didn't, especially from my mother-in-law and like my mom, and in good, like they were trying to be nice about it, but like they were like, why didn't you call us sooner? Like tell us what was happening. And it's like, because I
I
didn't
didn't
know what was
know.
happening. Like
Yeah.
I know it sounds crazy because not a lot of people have this experience, but it literally went from like nothing to everything. And at that point, I didn't have time to call anybody because it was already everything. And
Yeah.
looking back, if I would have known what I know now, everything would have been a lot smoother because I would have just had the baby like at my house where I was comfortable. And even if nobody was there, like I would at least have known kind of what to do in that situation. But yeah, especially if you're looking to birth at a hospital or at a birth center where you have to go there, it just does not give you a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yikes. I'm just thinking of all the babies that have been born on bathroom floors
Yeah.
or on the bay of the ER or in the hallway of the L&D units. We're trying to make our way that I have seen over the years. And it is just, precipitous labors are amazing. They really are. The human body is phenomenal. But if you experience one and you're not prepared, even if you are prepared, it can still really rock your socks. But if you're not prepared, it can sometimes actually be a little bit traumatic. And I think a lot of people don't expect that for sure. Okay, what gave you the confidence to continue to birth at the hospital? Even though you kept having bad experiences, did you know about midwifery care? What is that the norm where you are? What was that drive to keep returning to the hospital until your fourth birth, which you did? You were like, all right, I'm not taking any more of this.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it was confidence. I think it was, man, what's the opposite of confidence? Fear,
Like
maybe?
pressure? What were
Or
you
yeah,
scared
pressure
of
might.
not being at the hospital, or was there societal
No,
pressure where you were like, oh, I can't home
it was
birth?
more of, there was a culmination of things. So again, my mom is a doctor and she was friends with a lot of doctors. We grew up with that very like Western medicine, like very allopathic type of mentality. So I didn't even have, it never crossed my mind like that you wouldn't give birth in a hospital because that's just what the culture has told us. That's what I kind of grew up with thinking was normal. Like all the TV shows show women giving birth at a hospital. All of the things that you Google, it's like in a hospital. So that's just sort of, I guess, what was programmed into my brain. And it really wasn't until I was after I had my third, whenever I started seeing a chiropractor because I had some bad SI pain and I was doing like all the things, but I was like, I'm not going to try chiropractic care because like I grew up in this Western medicine, like Western medicine can help me and it can obviously, but I was like, I'm going to fix it like the way I want to fix it. If you haven't noticed by now, I have a bit of a stubborn streak to me. And so yeah, my husband though, he was like, you should try this chiropractic stuff. Like his uncle was a chiropractor. Like he grew up very much more like naturally ish minded. So I finally went and it was like, oh my goodness, like it stopped hurting. Like everything stopped hurting. And obviously it's not like a cure all for everything, but like for my specific thing, it stopped pain. And so, and I tried everything else. I tried PT, I tried meds, like stretching, I did all the things. And so that chiropractor was talking to us and he was like, oh yeah, I have 6 kids. I was like, wow, where'd your wife have her 6 kids? And he was like, oh, at our house. And I was like, what? Like, it's not a thing. And again, looking back, because it wasn't that long ago. It was only what, like 5 years ago that this happened. And I'm like, that's not a thing that people do. And he was telling me more about it. And at this point, my mind was getting opened to more of like this naturally minded thinking because of how I was having to heal from my second birth. So I was doing a lot of that work myself, and he just sort of like helped open the door. And so, yeah, it took a lot for me to go from the hospital to home. Not because necessarily I was scared of anything happening at home. Like I had that in the back of my head, but that wasn't necessarily the major factor. My major factor of like staying in the hospital was that how was I going to tell my family, who is all of these medical minded people, that I was leaving the hospital and choosing to do like a home birth and that sort of route. And so it was more of that. And honestly, we didn't even tell them. We didn't tell anybody what I was doing until the day that my son was going to be born. My husband loaded up our other kids, took them to my parents' house, and said, "Don't come by our house, please. Brigid's giving birth at home." And they were like, "What?" And that's just like the way that I felt comfortable doing it. I know I probably should have handled that in a more mature way, but like I just could not, I couldn't handle any sort of like, why are you doing this? Like, what? This is so dangerous. Like, I just couldn't mentally handle any of that because it was like right after COVID and like all that stuff. And I just like couldn't handle more trying to justify myself even more. So, so yeah, that's what ended up happening. And and it worked out pretty well. And then it was funny though, because afterwards you get the typical like, "Oh, Brigid, you're so brave for that like for doing that." And it's like, no, I'm not brave. I just finally like realized what I was capable of and started trusting myself.
Yes, you weren't lucky, you weren't brave, you just did what you knew needed to be done. That was the best for you and your baby. Oh, I could cry. Oh my gosh. That is so funny. And I don't think you owe anybody anything for your birth plan and like to tell them what's
Mm,
going on in your birth. So if you're listening, being like, ugh, I gotta tell these people, I don't think you have to. You can do it exactly like you did, Bridget, and just like not mention it, and they can assume what they want to assume about your birth and your care. And as long as you feel safe and confident doing it, then go for it. If you want a home birth.
yep.
You do have this stubborn streak, not the girl that refused to buy pregnancy tests when she was clearly pregnant. But where did you get that like resilient attitude that okay, I'm gonna do this again. I'm gonna try it again. I'm not gonna give up. I'm gonna make it better each time. Were you raised like that? Does that come from your parents?
Yeah, I would say in a way it does. I have four sisters, so it was kind of a different upbringing where there was a lot of emotions in our house. But it really was like they instilled in us, work hard, like don't give up, keep going, like all of those sorts of attributes were really important in our household. I do also think one really awesome thing that they did for us growing up was that they got us involved with horses and like being outside. So if you know anything about horses, you cannot force them to do anything. Like you have
Mm.
to work with them in order to do it, but you can't be a pushover with horses just because of the way that they are. Like they have this hierarchical structure. And so you have to really, I don't want to say it's not be the boss. Like that's not the right way to think of it. But like you have to be the one that is telling them what it or asking them to do certain things. So I think that was really important for me too, is to have that time growing up with horses because again, it made me be like, oh, I need to assert myself in certain situations. Like I need to not give up because if I give up, like I could get really hurt in this
Mm.
situation. And then one other big thing that happened is that for about 5 years or so, I suffered from disordered eating. And that was really hard to go through because, again, I went from like feeling like this is what I could control. So therefore, I'm going to control it so that I can make my body look a certain way to having this like eye opening moment where it was like, I can't control anything except I can trust that my body will do what it knows how to do if I fuel it well. So I think it was like kind of a bunch of different things culminating together, but those are probably the big three.
And are you incorporating horse work with your children? Are you on a farm? Do you, have lessons with horses or something? Is that something that you've brought into your family?
Yeah, so we live on a farm in Pennsylvania. We do have four horses on our property. Our kids have a little mini pony who is not particularly well behaved, but
Okay.
she is a kind pony.
And a
And then I
great
have,
lesson teacher, a great
yes,
pony of what we don't want to be in a pony. This pony could act better.
yes. So she's really good for them because she does not give anything away. Like she
Hmm.
makes them work for it. And there have been many, many times whenever they're riding, and we don't force them to ride or anything. It's whenever they want to. But whenever they're riding and they're just like crying and they're like, she won't walk. And they're sitting there just like kicking this little pony and she's just standing there like, okay. And it's like, well, then you need to make her walk. Like if like that's your job now that you're on her. Otherwise you're training her that she can get away with it. So it has been really good for them to be like, I need to do this thing and I need to I can stop once I do the thing, but I need her to take one step and then I like that's all I have to do. And it was interesting because our daughter, our 8-year-old, we put her on the pony and she was having like a lot of trouble with her. And then we put her on this other horse that we have who's like this 25-year-old old man who's just like a very nice horse. And it got her some confidence on him and then put her back on the pony. And she was like making this pony trot around and she was just like, this is so much fun. So I think that's another thing too is giving them the opportunity to do hard things, but also recognizing when they need a little bit of help and being like, okay, you need like to have some fun and not to just worry about getting this little pony to go. So I think there's like, yeah, we definitely work on that with our kids for sure.
There's a balance to strike of helping foster success for them so that they can boost their confidence, so that they can learn, okay, I can do this. This is fun. With the lessons learned of you have to work hard and don't give up and keep going. And, I think you guys sound like you're doing a really great job of striking that balance. So if someone doesn't live on a farm and they don't have a horse or right outside their at home in Boston, let's say, what other things could someone do, to help build resilience and that confidence in their children? This kind of like it's almost like a work ethic. It's part of our morals, I think.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so important to first, in case somebody's not familiar with what resilience actually is that there's a few different definitions, but the gist of it is that it's the ability for somebody to adapt in a positive way and to recover from stress, trauma, adversity, that sort of thing. To simplify it even further, it's almost like your ability to bounce back after something unexpected happens. So, with that in mind, if you are not near horses or near like somewhere that you can do something like that, there are definitely ways that you can start to build that resiliency in yourself, but also within your children and your whole family too. I am a big proponent of going outside, even whenever it's cold out. I'm not saying this to do this with like little itty bitty babies or anything like that, but if you have older kids, get them outside for a few minutes, and if even if it's bad weather, like they'll be okay. There's European countries where it's like their kids sit outside for 20 minutes a day or something, no matter what the weather, just because it's good for your immune system. And like so, just get them outside, ask them to do hard things, like trust that they are okay to do hard. So like our 6-year-old, he really loves cutting vegetables. And so that's one of the things that we let him do. He does not always do a great job. And yes, it can be dangerous with him with an actual knife, but by letting him do those things, it's really helping to instill that idea of like, I can do this thing even though it's hard for me. But also at his age, like mom's right beside me watching me so I don't chop my finger off. And then or even just like our 8-year-old is learning to cook, like just as simple as she's learning to make mac and cheese, where she has to like melt the butter, put the flour in it, like make the little roux, that sort of thing. And it's so simple, but allowing little kids to do things like that, even if they're so like slow and you could do it a million times faster, allowing them to do those things, I think really does give them a step up. And eventually it will make your life a lot easier too. But it just gives them that ability to step into their own abilities in a safe way so that they're doing hard things around mom and dad whenever they're little instead of waiting until they get older and being like, here, go figure out how to do all this stuff on your own.
Yeah. And it gives you a chance as a parent to practice that, conscious parenting almost of checking your own emotions and not rushing them. And why are we in a hurry? And so, what if it takes them that long to do it? I also love the reminder of at 6, they don't know that they're doing it imperfectly, but your 8-year-old is probably not too far off. By the time a child is 10, 12 years old, they can recognize that their stuff may not be as good as their peers. And so I think this is also a lesson to say, you may not do it perfectly the first time, and that's okay, and that's normal, and that's expected. The first time I learned to cut vegetables, I also wasn't good at it. They were different
Yeah.
sizes, and now I'm really good at it, and I can go really fast, but it's kind of what mommies do. We've been doing it for a long time, and so when you've been doing it as long as I have, you'll be this good too. And I think there's a lot of lessons there for everybody. Oh, I love that. Okay, what else do we need to know about raising resilient kids and or how do you keep your resiliency up as a mom with what I assume is probably very little me time? Like what is me time with 5 kids?
Well, we also homeschool too, so they're always around me.
Okay,
But
no me time at all.
no, and I think that that is a big thing is that changing my mindset about what that looks like has been really beneficial because I think that this was on purpose, but because we were thrown into having 5 kids in like 9 years, I sort of had to just, I don't want to say give everything up because I haven't. Like, I still do a lot of stuff for myself, but I've had to really change how I do certain things. So, for example, I can't just run outside and go ride my horse anymore. I have to be like, okay, husband, I'm going to leave for an hour and a half. You have all the kids. And it's more of just that like communication and still giving yourself permission to do the things that you want to do, but not just doing it on a whim, like thinking about other people. And I think that, again, changing your mindset helps increase your own resiliency because it allows you to still see opportunities, but it also keeps you like grounded in what it is that you're doing right now. And so that's something I work on a lot with clients is being present where they are right now and not thinking about what's next or what happened in the past or whatever. And then another really, really big one is finding like joy. So a lot of a lot of what I went through whenever I was postpartum with my number two, which is when all that stuff happened, is I was so drained because I was still trying to do everything the way that I did it before and not taking on this new identity of like I'm a mom of two. And so I lost a lot of joy. I remember I was like, nothing is fun anymore. Like everything just feels terrible. Everything just feels hard. Like it was just not a fun time at all in my life. And I remember going into that next new year, you know how everybody picks a word for the year? I picked joy because that's what I really wanted to have because I hadn't really experienced that before. And I mean, like I had happiness where I was like, I have videos of myself like dancing and like playing with the kids. So I was like happy, but it wasn't joyful. And there is a difference. I don't have my dictionary, so I can't tell you the definitions. But there is a difference. So like happy is like you're just happy, everything's good. But joyful is like this inner spark where it's like everything is just good. And so that's a big one that I work on for myself and also for clients because if you go into this, if you have this mindset of like everything is good, like everything will work out for me. What's the saying? Like all work works, whether it's working on you or for you. And so just having that different mindset like literally changes your brain and makes it bounce back. So if there's some adversity or something that happens, instead of sitting like, oh, this thing happened, it's like, oh man, this thing happened, but I can do this or whatever it is. So I think just giving yourself that permission to work on changing that mindset a little bit and still doing things for you, but it might just look different than what it did before. And yeah, just trying to be really grateful for everything that you have in your life.
Yeah. I love the mantras. Mantras are really important to me. They're very quick and easy for me to kind of like keep in my back pocket for when things pop up. And they are such an easy way for me to get control of my mindset when I'm spiraling. A little simple mantra will just it'll just do wonders for me. Okay, it dropped into my head as you were talking about these like narratives that we make up about ourselves or motherhood or our children or our spouses or our mother-in-laws or whatever it is, whoever it is, everyone's got their own vice that the narratives are around. But you seem to be really good at not giving into those and at recognizing when those pop up and at kind of pivoting when you notice them. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'll say I'm definitely not perfect. I definitely have days whenever I'm like, everything's terrible, it's falling apart, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I definitely have those days. But one tool that I do is I don't do like extensive journaling every day, but every day I at least write like today was a good day or today was not a good day. So that I can look back and be like, okay, this was not a good day. I wonder why this wasn't a good day. And I can read through. So I have like this little journal that I do. And then every day I always go through and I write each of my kids' names and my husband's name, and I write something that was really good or like funny that I want to remember or like cute that they did. And so just doing that at the end of the day just helps me reflect back and be like, oh, good things did happen today. Even if bedtime was a like terrible tornado, like things were good that happened. And then another one that I do, again, I'm big into prayer, so I pray pretty frequently throughout the day, even if it's just like while I'm holding laundry or taking a walk. But another one that I do is that whenever I notice myself feeling something, I will literally just say to myself, say I'm feeling angry or whatever. I will literally just say, I recognize that I am feeling angry. And just by giving yourself that little pause to acknowledge what it is that you're feeling, it gives your brain that time to do whatever it needs to do in order to reframe it, in order to see something good out of it. So that's been one really big one. And there have actually, just last week, I noticed I was feeling really overwhelmed with things. And I said, like, I recognize that I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I immediately just felt calmer after
Mm.
saying that because I've trained my brain to be like, okay, this is a little break. We're good now. And so, yeah, that's one of the big things I do.
It almost interrupts that spiral. So instead of just spiraling and spiraling and spiraling, it really kind of interrupts that and you name it, which we know there's a lot of power in that. And then I think it just helps you to move forward. I love a good mantra. Okay, you do a lot of resiliency work with women that have birth trauma. I think we've pretty well established why resiliency is important in everyday life, but kind of specifically in terms of birth trauma, what kind of work are you doing with people and who benefits from this type of coaching?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of moms who've had, I try to say like tough births because if you say traumatic births, sometimes they're like, oh, my birth wasn't that bad.
Hmm.
So if I try to stay more of like the general, if you felt like you weren't listened to, if your body was like taken out of your hand, whatever it was. So that's what I do with them is to really help them to go back in their story just for like 1 or 2 sessions. And one thing that I do is I help them see Jesus in their story. And that's again because I work with a lot of Christian moms. And so we see Jesus in their story. And I was doing this on Monday with a client. This was our second session, and we did this exercise. And she just said, like, my whole idea of what happened during my birth is totally different now. She was like, the memory's the same, but it feels different now. Like it feels more peaceful. And I forget the other words that she used. So that's the biggest thing that I do is I try to help them see we don't change the memory of their birth. Like that's there. That's can't change that. But what I help them to see is that they weren't alone in it and that even if things happened that shouldn't have happened or that if somebody did something to them that was really terrible, that again, it wasn't their fault. They didn't deserve that to happen, and that we don't know how or why or when, but something good will come of it. And as far as like why this is important to work on this, because a lot of women will just say, like, oh, it happened, I'll get over it, it'll be fine. But one of the really big things is that having these high resilience levels is actually associated with better mental health outcomes. It's associated with reduced postpartum depression. It's associated with improving coping strategies during the perinatal period and just, again, parenthood in general. It helps parents to navigate ups and downs of raising children. And one other big thing is that, again, a lot of times women will think, like, oh, I'll just get over it. It's not a big deal, but I've actually worked with two moms. One of them, her child was 19 years old, and the other one was 23 years old, I believe. And they both said that they were still feeling the effects of what happened all those years ago. That every year on the one son's birthday, she was like, I hate his birthday because it just all came back to her. And again, it's just healing yourself and increasing resiliency around your birth and motherhood is important for your birth specifically, but it trickles into everything. Because if you don't have a birth experience that makes you feel like powerful, beautiful, strong woman that you are, then that's going to trickle into every area of your life, whether that be your relationship with your spouse, your children, just like your own personal feelings about yourself. It's going to trickle into everything. So it's really important that women understand that they deserve a good birth experience.
Yeah. I have recently in the last 2 years, but recently been doing a lot of education around the nervous system and just understanding how that can impact things as well. And it feels just very aligned to this whole resiliency talk. I have a question about the idea of like, we don't know when or how or why, but something good will come of this. What about people who feel as if that might be a little dismissive or they say like, that just can't be possibly true. I guess what kind of pushback do you get from that and how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, so it is a very simplified expression what I just said. There's a lot more to it. I think one of the biggest things to remember is that the population that I'm working with is Christian. So they typically will have this view of like God brings good from things. And so it really is just a matter of, and I don't say this to them in like the first or second session. It's like later on. But actually, I don't even say it to them. We just like that's sort of
Yeah,
it's
I
a general.
imagine they kind of get to it on them
Yeah.
by themselves. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
So for example, one woman was telling me about her story. We go through her full story and then we do this exercise to see where Jesus is. And then like in the third or fourth session, she looks at me and she goes, I just remembered that the songs that I requested for them whenever I had the C-section was, I don't know, it was like Chris Tomlin or some big Christian artist. She was like, and I don't even really like that song, but like that's what I wanted to listen to that day. And then she was like, she had the C-section, everything. And I guess she said afterward, the OR nurse came back to her and said, thank you for playing that song. That's exactly what I needed to hear that day. And it's like, and she came to this on her own and she was like, so I'm not saying that I had a C-section just for like this woman to hear this song, but like that's the good that's coming from it is that this happened and now this other person is getting something good from it, and that helped her feel much better about the situation. So again, she couldn't like fix it, but it helped her feel that what happened to her wasn't like for naught, like good did come from it. And it is a process, like it's not just, I wish it was like a light switch I could just turn on, but it really is this process of like helping them trust themselves again so that they can see that again they didn't do anything wrong, that their body didn't fail them, that they are a good mom. And usually, whenever they get to those truths, they can then see, like, oh, I did need to go through this because now I'm this, like, strong, resilient woman who can take on the world. Not that I wasn't strong before, but I'm a different kind of strong now.
Yeah. Birth will do that to you. A different kind of strong. You're just like a different human on the other side.
Yeah,
After
for sure.
each birth, too.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Oh my goodness. This has been such a good conversation. I'm just looking over my notes to see if there was anything that I missed. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch on that I haven't asked about?
I think one interesting thing to think about too is like you were saying with the nervous system. So there's this field of it's called psychoneuroimmunology that's really interesting, and I'm not going to get into like the nitty-gritty science of it, but basically it's the science of mind, body, and how it's all connected. So essentially how like what you're putting into your body will affect your brain, and then how you're thinking affects your body and your soul and everything like that. And I think that that's an important thing to note is that we are we have these different parts of us, but they all are really connected, and we need to nourish all of our parts. So we talked a lot about brain today, but in terms of resiliency and your brain, nutrition is also super, super important. Like our brain is made up of, what is it, 80% fat or something, or 60% fat, and then your immune system is 80% in your gut. So it's like you need to be eating things that are going to nourish your brain because the more nourished your brain is, the more resilient it is. So if you are not eating well, if you are not eating enough, if you are eating whatever it is, your brain is literally going to have not like little brain injuries, but it's not going to be able to function in the same way as it would if you were well nourished. And then in that regard, too, if you have had any sort of actual PTSD, like clinical PTSD, nutrition is super, super important because your brain needs to heal. And in order to heal, it needs all those good fats and the different vitamins and whatever it is. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind too, is that mind, body, and soul are all really, really important for this increasing resiliency and just moving into womanhood as best we can.
And setting yourself up for a positive, healthy, you know, postpartum. Oh,
Oh yeah,
I love
100%.
it. I love it so much. Okay, Bridget, where can people connect with you if they wanted to work with you or follow you or share their story or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so I'm primarily on Instagram. It's just at Brigid.Tebaldi, so BRIGID.TEBALDI. I'd love if you send me a voice memo. I love voice memos, or just send me a message. Or if you wanted to check out my website, it's just www.loretowellness.com, and that's just LORETO wellness.
I love it. All right, you guys. Well, I will see you in the next episode. Bridget, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom and your amazing up leveling of your birth stories from two birth stories that I had my jaw on the floor to such an angelic, just joyous, empowering, awesome, awesome, dare I say, ideal birth experience for your last baby or currently last baby. I have enjoyed following you on Instagram and I can't wait to see if you have more kids as your family expands and to just follow on your journey. So, thanks for being here. All right, you guys, be sure to follow Bridget on social media and you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe and at the.birth.lounge. Until next time, head to your app store and download the Birth Lounge app for evidence based childbirth education and data driven support delivered straight to your phone. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I truly do value this community and I love hanging out with you. You deserve to have a birth that you love with a provider that values your autonomy and respects informed consent. It's an honor to be your go-to gal when it comes to preparing for your baby. If you found today's episode helpful, share it with a friend. Share it with someone who could use evidence-based information to help them have an informed and confident birth. I'd love to hear what you have to say and read your sweet words. By leaving us a review, you are helping other expectant mamas and their families find the podcast so that we can reduce birth trauma and improve maternity care in the U.S. one birth at a time. If you're interested in joining the Birth Lounge, go to thebirthlounge.com. If you want to connect with me on socials, you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe on all platforms. Until next time, stay educated, stay supported, stay confident. Bye.